Hey Pat, thank you for joining us on the Engineering Manifestos podcast to share your learnings and experiences building teams and products over the course of your career. Thanks again for taking the time.
Yeah, of course, pleasure to be here. I'm always happy to try to help others reduce the amount of iterations of learning and overhead to avoid some of the same mistakes I have in the past.
Absolutely, absolutely. So let's start with a brief introduction about yourself. Obviously, people can go and read up LinkedIn and other sources, but a quick intro in your own words, briefly, before we jump into the meat of the podcast.
Yeah, totally. I'll try to be brief. So yeah, I'm Pat Cullen, and I've been in the software engineering industry for about a little over 15 years, in leadership for about 10. And in the last decade, I managed a large chunk of a publicly traded company in the e-commerce space that was called Commerce Hub, now Rhythm now it's called Rhythm. From there, I went to Carrot, where I joined as employee number 8, and we scaled up from 8 employees to 500, and from about 3 engineers to about 70 to 75 within the technology team, all reporting through me. And most recently, I've been doing more fractional consulting work, but just excitingly started full time with a company called Year One as their CTO. We're a small shop, just coming out of a stealth on a new product in the coming weeks, where we are working on uh, ingesting, enhancing, and normalizing the vast sources of team dynamic data. Think things like Jira and GitHub, and trying to make sense of that for the modern team, as we saw a opportunity in the market to improve and coach individuals, teams, and organizations on that data in a more concise way than the existing options that organizations have.
Great. Yeah. Good luck with your new role and the venture. Okay.
Yeah.
Sure. So let's get started. So we sort of talk in three different chunks as part of this discussion with the engineering leaders. One is around the area of product planning and engineering strategy. So that's basically how you work with the leadership team in terms of providing feedback into the resourcing, planning, and all of that, and then building out the estimations and all of those pieces. That's one, and then the other piece is around building the actual team and culture. That's the second piece, and then the last but not least piece is the execution aspect of it, right? The processes and systems that you put in place to make sure that the plans that you've put in place are executed successfully by the team. So let's start with the product planning and engineering strategy. Obviously, the different leaders use different frameworks and approaches to how they go about the product planning pieces of things. I listened to one of your podcasts and you had shared about your experiences, early experiences at Carrot working with your CEO, where there was a push for roadmaps, and given that you're working in an agile iterative manner, you had some concerns with that and so forth. But obviously, from a business standpoint, you do need that sense of roadmap and prioritization and planning. And so maybe let's start with that, and if you can share your thoughts, your approaches on how you've handled product planning and engineering strategy when working with your leadership teams and your engineering teams as well.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Maybe we start by riffing a little bit on that, the nature of roadmaps. So, yeah, I can remember it was probably about 10 years ago reading a write-up called No Estimates and trying to push for that nature of just like essentially not estimating anything and working on only what we felt was the most important thing. But it's such a complex ecosystem, especially as your organization scales. Um, and and the nature of all the different like players in these more complex like if it like space where unless you're this very much like strictly technology only play, you likely are bringing a feature, a value, a new product to market with very many different dynamic roles that need to collaborate and stay aligned along that journey. It could be you could have a go-to-market arm, even if it's just strictly technology, where they have to launch it and they have to communicate it. You might want to have prime some of your existing customers with teasers towards where you're going so that you can promote adoption. And all of those things require some level of checks and connections with all of the different players in that space in your organization. So you have to stay connected with the sales team, the marketing team. Maybe you have customer success roles that need to manage the features. And the more that that gets complex, the more it makes sense to have some semblance of a roadmap. And it doesn't take much for it to get complex. You can get a handful of people and it can already create value so that you have these it's almost like designated check-ins where you predict towards where you're going. And once I started to move away from realizing that you shouldn't, what's the American idiom? Something like don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. You should always like pragmatically reflect on why you're thinking about something like no roadmaps and realize that it's one of the earliest lines in the Agile manifesto is something along the lines of people over process.
Mhm.
So as long as you have the right people, then there's many processes that can work and you can adapt those to your needs. If you find that you're working with people that force hard restrictions on deadlines of roadmaps, then there's opportunities there to renegotiate or understand why. Because ultimately, we were trying to create value to most companies are built to generate revenue. So there's probably some stressor going on. So the more that you can like expand your Venn diagram of understanding of those around you, lean a little further into understanding sales needs or marketing needs or whatever it may be, the better that you can be that like effective peer and counterpoint to that entire, complex organization's needs. Because ultimately you all have the same goal, which is to create value. And there's probably a reason that they're pressing certain stressors.
Sure, sure. No, thank you. Thanks. And more specifically, your experience at Carrot, like if you can share a little bit on how you adapted and evolved to that, starting with this iterative model towards
Yeah.
the roadmap approach in terms of the product planning.
Yeah, I think the most important, like, if you're going to take like a very macro concept out of this, is that all of these topics are not binary. They're all on a spectrum with various implementation strategies. And I find that if you maybe even take each concept and like split it into threes, then you're probably going to have a much better time with having like essentially three processes. So if we're talking about planning, there's probably three processes. If we're talking about execution, there's probably three processes.
Mhm.
And so what do I mean? Um, let's take planning at the at an organization. You might want annual, quarterly, and then like weekly or biweekly as your three concepts. That means that you have a different strategy for estimations at annual, quarterly, and then maybe somewhere near the weekly level. That means that you have different specificity in your goals at an annual, quarterly, or weekly level.
Mhm.
And if you take that approach, and you really push for that more of that core strategy at the annual level, then we're talking about things like I think a lot of people have heard the concept of t-shirt sizing, and they might actually be afraid of it because they're worried that the estimate will be taken into those other tiers. But if you structure those tiers so that your t-shirt sizing is meant for annual, then when you move into quarterly, you can do refinement to the t-shirt size and say, hey, we haven't converted this. We're getting closer, so we should do another iteration where we get a little more specificity before we start working into that quarterly level. So the same could be said when you think about the difference between like outcomes and outputs,
Mhm.
um, where at an annual level, your focus should be more on outcomes. And I say that, but like keep in mind that everybody wants to work in the concrete. So it's okay to hint towards possible features and know just as long as you create a culture of nothing being promised, but these are just opportunities. And then as you move into the quarterly, it's probably it needs to get pretty specific at that point, depending on the complexity of your organization. But you're going to need further alignment as you get into actual implementation, like upfront iterations of some concept work on what a feature might look like in collaboration with your design team prior to that quarter starting. You still have a lot of flexibility, but the lines start to be like rigid, right?
Mhm.
So at the annual level, you've got this blank sheet. You're kind of doing like abstract art. At the quarterly level, maybe you start to draw like with a fat marker, not something that you can write a bunch of detail, but like the shapes of things. And then at the weekly level, that's when you're really getting into like the detail of what you should be doing because you're actually at the implementation phase. So like more important than any of the specifics of how you do that, I think is the theme of approaching it that way. And then there's tons of tools in your toolkit for how to approach annual planning. I'm a big fan of, um, I think there's a pretty prevalent, I guess I would say blogger or content creator, John Cutler. I think he dislikes annual planning so much that he created a toolkit for it because he wanted to make sure that he had like an effective set of like options for people
Mhm.
to choose from to help kind of keep the process on rails and avoid it being a like 3 month slog where you get to the end and then you feel like 6 months later that it was all a waste because it spent so much time and new information came in your environment 6 months later, such that maybe you should have only done 10% of what you did.
Got it. Got it. Sure. Thank you. Thanks, Pat. I think that is definitely helpful in terms of thinking in the annual, quarterly, and weekly slash biweekly level. So I guess the next section that we wanted to talk about was around building the engineering team and culture. Again, different leaders have different approaches in terms of hiring practices, and how do they size and structure the teams, how do they ensure collaboration, how do they handle conflict resolution, ensure transparency, the titles and structures within the team, promotion processes, hiring and firing, and so forth. So maybe we don't necessarily need to go into each of those areas, but at a broader level, what's your approach and philosophy to building engineering teams and cultures over the course of your experience?
Yeah, yeah. So let's split it into threes again, and we'll go like your first 10 and your next couple dozen into like you're scaling towards the hundreds because each one of those has different stressors. When you're hiring your first couple engineers on your team, strong preference towards network because these like each person is a substantial like facet of the business at that size, like two engineers, three engineers, four engineers. And if you're not careful, adding one engineer from three to four can actually make the team go much slower. There was a talk about this, or like a little write-up from, I think it was Atlassian's product discovery team when they started scaling like from like 7 to like 15, and they felt with all of that complexity that they went almost the same speed actually as the smaller team. So I think being very selective and the best way to vet is to have hands-on experience with those people. Don't be afraid of contractors if you're unsure of your scale at that size too, like expert contractors that cost a premium, but are gonna drive results. That'd be phase one. As you get over, let's say, 10 engineers,
Mhm.
I think that's when you start needing to add some more rigorous structure. And you should nearing 10 start to have like this is all, like I said, nothing's like you flip the switch. This is all this like flowing evolution. So you've probably at that point already started to vet with some sort of technical exercise. And each culture is different, but for me, I drive on generally three core values for my career framework. One is technical because at the end of the day, engineering teams need to create technical value. The other is a facet around accountability, and I'll get into that in a minute. And then the third is this concept of team cultivation. So technical, I think this is the one where everyone focuses. So you've got different coding exercises that you can do here. I am not a fan of like homework. I'm more of a fan of like a collaborative implementation exercise and then a collaborative like technical big pictures exercise, something that can emphasize more of an architectural facet. Ideally, at the architectural level, you're actually making them talk about something they've done
Mhm.
versus giving them a like the implementation, I think should be more of a practical, where the architecture ideally is more like experience based. And I prefer spending like a whole hour there, like a whole hour on one thing, one major architectural like accomplishment you've made, and walk us through it. Whiteboard the system. There's plenty of tools like Miro, FigJam, whatever, for those that are remote that can do this. And then team cultivation, I think it's become, and like you could oversimplify it to say communication, but I'd say that that's become more important every couple of years. It like just seems to double in its necessity for an engineering team because a lot of the like granular technical facets, while important, um, are becoming easier to solve. Like if I run into syntax issues, I can just use AI coding tools to help solve that for me. But what I can't solve is effective communication on elaborating product requirements to translate them into the most effective implementation details. Because I've seen plenty of super strong technical engineers that, because they couldn't interpret the ask, because most of the time people don't actually want what they ask you for. You have to like unpack it, think about why they're asking you for that, and then realize that like sometimes the answer is actually deleting an entire thing instead of adding anything. So there's different exercises we have with like I've done in the past with like vague requirements and doing essentially like a requirement elaboration exercise with the person. And that scales pretty well. I think when you get to like dozens of people, you need to start having like there's a broader term that I deployed where you had like working groups with working group leaders, and hiring would be one of those working groups. Maybe like it's almost akin to like the guild concepts from Spotify, but like as an there will be single responsibilities that I prefer hiring to kind of be like an aggregate. I think Google does this too, or Facebook, where they like distribute you back out if you vet the like unified process.
Mhm.
So you don't necessarily interview for a specific team. Um, so I like that too, but that generally means you're probably going to need, for lack of better terms, like lieutenants within your management team, or it could be within just your leadership team. I think management's even too specific. It could be particular engineers that are highly passionate about the process of finding their next teammate.
Sure, sure. Just to make sure I got the three pieces. Obviously, you talked about the technical capability and the team cultivation aspect of it. Was there a third piece around
Yeah, yeah, good call out.
accountability that?
Accountability. I like two really simple questions, and it just depends on your seniority. I'm all about depth versus breadth. So one approach I like is, or one question I like is, what would you consider your most significant team accomplishment and why? And literally spending an hour on that. So basically, in a collaborative group, how were you able to execute on something rather complex? And usually, if it whatever bubbles to the top, there should be strong evidence of like the concept of runs to fire. Like there's a fire in the house. Like we want the people that run to it to try to put it
Mhm.
out. You want the people that are passionate about identifying gaps, trying to minimally illuminate, but ideally have accountability towards resolving them because all culture, all organizational dynamics are emergent, continuously evolving. That's why we have things like retrospectives and emphasis on continuous improvement. So that accountability facet in combination with team cultivation is the insurance to make sure that your team grows without having this like in I'll say and minimizes as much as possible the organizational debt that comes with scaling.
Sure, Thank you. Thanks. I think again, the threes approach of thinking through things is really helpful. I remember, a VP of mine many years ago said people can't remember more than three things at a time. So it's good to sort of talk in threes. So continuing along on the third piece of the discussion around execution processes and systems. I know you've written a lot in your Substack, strategic spokes around engineering strategy, and how as you grow from smaller to larger sizes, how the documentation side of things in terms of writing down your decisions and then reviewing it and then building it out as the team grows. So that's a good way to make sure that your processes can scale as you grow. But I also want to take some time to get your maybe 3 points on processes and systems, right? How do you think about it? How do you approach it, and how do you set up your teams for executing?
Yeah. Yeah. Um, I feel like I had this evolutionary path with the nature of Agile, which I think a lot of people have, where it is like first resistance and then over adaptation or adoption, over adoption, and then so it's like I'll say over adoption into like enabling too abstractly, and then into this pragmatic middle ground. So you start in the beginning where you become like almost like a zealot, and you can be super excited, and you're like everybody should story point everything, and we need to stay strict to this, and we need to reduce whip, whatever the flavor of agile may be. Um, and then at some point that like you realize the shortcomings of it because it just corners a lot of the things you do, and then you just want to just state the agile manifesto and say you everybody just solve that, and you realize that these like emergent managers you have are just kind of lost in this like just tell me how to do things. So where I've kind of landed is my own flavor of a paved path for whatever organization I'm in, as we scale to multiple teams, where I say like, okay, this is how you can do weekly planning to quarterly planning. This is a template for your weekly plan. This is how you can report up any concerns. This is how you can do stand-ups. This is how you can run your stand-ups. This is how you can like here's a template board for Jira for how you can set all of your stages up. And then they can choose that. But then I've adopted from the book Sooner Safer Happier this concept they have of minimum viable compliance. So like what do I actually need as a leader to make sure that I have effective signal bidirectionally? And that's going to be way less than that definition. So I have an implementation detail, but almost like for like building code, right? My interface is really thin, but my implementation, I have a defined implementation set that you could run with, and you could just use it. Or you could, as long as you keep to my interface though, which is like I need to have some sort of signal at a weekly level of what is on track, what isn't, and what concerns do you have. I need some signal at a biweekly to monthly level of like what experiments you're running to improve as the team you're working on keeps changing. And then I need signal at the like 3 month level on like what we didn't hit because it'll always be something, and how you're going to adjust in the next 3 months, something along those lines. But within that detail, you can execute in very unique ways, or you can say that's not where I want to focus. I want to focus on maybe like some technical strategic investments. So I'm just going to use the off the shelf that Pat gave us for execution. That's kind of like a Scrum Kanban hybrid from that I've like just kind of picked the parts I like the most. So that's like narrow execution. Um, Teams, I think I'm I'm not comfortable getting too specific on teams for the most part because I think there's personal dynamics and then there's work dynamics. So some work, for example, I love erring on the side of pair programming as an execution pattern, but I know that there's plenty of work that just it's actually much more effective if you can just not be in a pair because it's just this cognitive like stack that you have to build that if you work with someone else on it, for me, at least personally, I get lost. So I'm actually better, you know, getting like no sound and just spending 2 to 3 hours by myself. So I think execution dynamics within like the daily level is something that I can give direction to, but I prefer not to be too specific.
Got it. Got it. Sure. Thank you. Thanks. I think that's again, good framework for thinking about execution. Being flexible and ensuring you have the signals that you need for managing at your level while providing the guardrails for the team to execute to the plan. So thank you. Thanks. So yeah, it was great to hear your thoughts on these three buckets. Anything top of mind that you'd like to share in terms of uh, you know in general building teams and products?
The only other thing I would say that comes to mind is that like there are no villains, so always start from a place of curiosity and empathy when you feel like you have a reaction that feels negative to your ecosystem. It's gonna happen. It's gonna happen often, honestly. And take the time to maybe if it's usually a particular person at a particular event of something that like that. Like take the time to like think through like why are they attempting to do what they do? What are the likely stresses that are leading to this? And a lot of times when you sit there and reflect, you'll realize that like you might have you might have come to like a negative reaction for something where somebody was trying to stretch to help, but then it felt like it was overstepping your boundaries. And all of a sudden you may turn from a like defensive mode into a state of acknowledgement. And you can acknowledge someone for an effort, even if you don't agree with the output. You can acknowledge them to say, like, I appreciate that you're taking cycles to try to improve our process. And it's very thoughtful of you to be invested in that facet. And it can be easy to ignore it and just go heads down on whatever work comes next. So all of a sudden you're going to build more trust and likely increase that healthy collaborative conflict in a positive way.
Great. Thank you. Thanks, Pat. Thanks once again for taking the time and sharing your learnings and experiences. And good luck with your new role and venture. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot.